You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about John Carpenter's font. And that's right, we're talking about the font that John Carpenter has used in a lot of his movies because, well, we're geeky designers that love John Carpenter and a good typeface. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. So, Pete, folks may not know when they listen to our rants and raves on the Fan2Fan Podcast. We're both designers. We're both into graphic design. We both appreciate a well-designed movie poster, what have you. And one thing that we both look at that maybe, I want to say, non-designer folks may not see are fonts.
Yes, I think when you've been in the business, as they say, as long as we have, it's fun to pick out fonts and font styles to the point of annoyance of most of our loved ones probably. But as designers, we get excited coming across certain fonts in the wild that like, oh, I know that. Like you see it on some sign or on a billboard or on storefront somewhere. And it's just, it's fun for us to talk about. So yeah, I appreciate, not only do I appreciate a good font, I appreciate spotting a good font out there in the universe.
Especially when you know that someone with an eye for design, with an eye for storytelling, knows that if you pick the right font, it can tell a story, especially if it kind of comes with a little bit of a legacy. And for folks that are listening to this, they're like, we have no clue what you're talking about. I'm going to give you a few examples, right? So there's this font called Beguiat, Beguiat. If you've seen the Choose Your Own Adventure books that Pete and I grew up on,
it's back. It's more frightening than before. Stephen King's epic The Stand. Experience the terror of 350 pages you weren't allowed to see before. This $24.95 hardcover is yours for just $7.95 when you enter the chilling world of the Stephen King library. Imagine an exclusive collection of horror, Pet Sematary, The Shining, Christine, the chart toppers, the books that became blockbuster movies. All in original hardcovers at just $14.95 each, all with a cancel anytime guarantee. But if you want the terror to last, we'll send you a new volume, including King's new releases about every 7 weeks. Enjoy each for 10 days. There's never an obligation to buy. Possess The Stand with no risk. The Stephen King Library, where the master is coming back to haunt you.
Call 1-800-521-2800 now to get The Stand. Keep it and pay just $7.95 plus shipping and handling. Future volumes will come, one every 7 weeks, each with a 10-day free trial. Keep only the ones you want. Cancel anytime.
If you've seen just about any Stephen King book, it's also kind of known as the, quote, Stephen King font. Or if you've seen some recent horror movies, Malignant, Barbarian, or Netflix's Stranger Things, you're looking at Beguiat. That's that font that has like a very cool airiness in some ways, has some serif, it's bold. It's very much synonymous with those. And speaking of another synonymous font, there's Trajan, Trajan. And if you're a fan of horror movies, there's The Conjuring, The Mothman Prophecies, Interview with a Vampire, all the like Platinum Dunes remakes for like Nightmare on Elm Street, Last House on the Left, Amityville Horror. They all shared that same font. That one's a little leaner, has a bit more of like a gothic sensibility to it. But if you see it, you've seen it a lot of different ways. You've seen it a few times.
This typeface, Trajan, is probably one of the most popular movie poster fonts ever. You can see it in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Double Jeopardy, Legends from Iwo Jima, Titanic, Joe Black, Ash in the Bottle. It's everywhere. In 1989, designer Carol Twombly adapted inscriptions from Roman Emperor Trajan's column into a digital typeface. It was made for Adobe, so it was a part of the software that a lot of people were starting to use to make posters. A couple years later, it made its movie poster debut here for Hector Babenco's At Play in the Fields of the Lord. After that, it was on The Bodyguard and Scent of a Woman. Then it was on 3 1993 box office hits. By 1994, it was everywhere.
Then there's ITC Serif Gothic. Doesn't take much thumbnail viewing or scanning on Tubi or any streaming platform to find it on a ton of like low budget indie horror flicks because it just screams low budget indie horror flick. And it's been used on The Void, Here Comes the Devil, The Breach, and it all makes sense, Pete, because that font originated with arguably one of the grandpappies of modern day horror, John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978.
It did. on the title card, title screen.
Michael Audrey Myers shall be tried as an adult for the murder of his sister, Judith Margaret Myers.
You fooled them, haven't you, Mike? But not me.
It's a holiday you'll remember forever.
Halloween night is when people play tricks on each other.
What about the boogeyman?
Death has come to your little town, Sheriff.
Jamie Lee Curtis.
What's the boogeyman?
Donald Pleasance.
As a matter of fact, it was.
In a film by John Carpenter.
Oh, no.
Halloween. Next.
It's obviously iconic at this point. You don't have to be a designer. If you consume movies streaming on your streaming platform of choice, you will probably come across these on thumbnails and a lot of those type movies that you just mentioned, Bernie. I think it's an easy way to conjure up memories of something like Halloween. And you may not be watching anything close to as good as Halloween, but if it's enough to kind of draw you in and get you to click play, then its job has been done. And such is the power of certain fonts. Like you said, like if you're using a font in a certain way, using a certain typeface to evoke something, whether it's reminding you of something like Halloween or just, again, like this is like a gothic ghost story. So we've got the tall, thin serif font as opposed to something that might be more futuristic, like a sans serif font, like a Futura. If you put that on House on Haunted Hill, there's a bit of a disconnect there.
I'm Vincent Price, and you're invited to my party in the house on Haunted Hill, where so far the ghosts have murdered only 7 people. So won't you come and make it 8?
And I know we're getting a little bit into designer weeds here on this, but this is stuff as designers that we not only think about, but we have to think about because we want to evoke a certain reaction out of the person seeing this stuff. And so choosing the right font or choosing a certain type of font, it takes that kind of thought to go into it. And so, something like ITC Gothic is now iconic because of that. You know, it's interesting. I was looking up some articles on it just to see what other people were saying about it. And there was a guy who tracked down these, I can't remember what they're called. They're certain type of sheets that if you would go into software like InDesign or whatever, you've got like your glyphs and ligatures. Yeah, this is going back to the days before the software. So like if you're using a font, you'd have these sheets that could allow you to choose like glyphs. So if you look closely, if you look at the poster to Halloween and then I believe the title screen, and I can't remember if this is for the original or from transfer from original to the more recent one, the E's are very different. The E's are rounded on one and they are more straight lines on the other. And that was not a mistake per se. There are alternative characters to the font that can be used. And again, like if you're using a software now that has glyphs, they might show up there, and not just your default. If you're typing away on your keyboard and you type in the letter E, it's going to look a certain way. But with certain fonts, you get other options, and so it allows you some differentiation. Or again, it might just be a different aesthetic look that you're going for, and it allows you to do that without having it be so uniform all the time. So I'm exhausting myself getting so far into the weeds, but I thought that was like an interesting, little exercise that this one person had done, and they tracked down like those old sheets and had a picture of them. And this is how type was kind of set back in the days before, we have the software to do it for us so easily now.
It makes sense because you also talked about making choices, aesthetic decisions, right, that fit. And guess who has made that choice about a font multiple times? It's John Carpenter. So Carpenter is known for using the Albertus typeface in his titles and a lot of promotional materials for a lot of his films. That font, whether you knew it was called Albertus before listening to this episode or not, very iconic, very much closely associated with his films. I mean, I think it's fair to say, like, when it's not used, I think I'm kind of surprised because along with like the synth music that he used, it's kind of a trademark. When you see John Carpenter and you see John Carpenter's, like if it's not in Albertus, I'm kind of taken aback just because it feels like it should be.
Mm-hmm.
I did see that it was designed, the font, by Berthold Wolpe, Wolpe, in the 1930s.
Yep.
And like you were talking about, like sans serif and serif. And just for the record, the serif are those little small lines, the little things that kind of extend
stems
from the letters, from the strokes. Yeah, the stems, right? Well, Berthold Wolpe designed Albertus, and it has that kind of like elegant serif letters. It feels a very gothic, and it makes sense because a lot of Carpenter's film have that genre, horror, sci-fi, gothic feel. So the distinct visual identity that Carpenter has in his films, in his music, works out with the fonts that he chose.
Best directors you know, other than some experience, talent, and luck, the best ones you know, what do they have? Is there a common denominator? Is it the ability to tell a story? Is it the ability to somehow...
They see. They can see. They can see. The best directors can see. Some directors don't tell great stories. Some directors are a little bit better off with more lyrical material. Some people aren't, everybody's different, but they can visualize it. They can see. This is what movies are, pictures. Sometimes they have dialogue, sometimes they don't, but it's about seeing things.
That's true about most people who do something very well, isn't it? I mean, certainly if they're creative or entrepreneurial, there is the ability to see. Mm-hmm. If they're businessmen and women, it's the ability to see how the deal will work. Painters can see where they're going.
That's right. So I would say it's the same for a movie maker. Have a vision. He has a vision of something that means something to him, can see it on the screen before it's there, and that's simply creativity, talent.
Do you like the editing process?
I do very much. It's a rewriting process. Basically, you've shot one movie, and if you want to make it work differently, you can. You can rewrite a film by the editing.
Are you there for every frame for the edit, or you go in and have somebody else do a rough cut, and then you come in and...
Well, I don't literally cut it myself.
No, I know that, but you know what I mean. Obviously, I understand that. But some people just have an editor who they've long known and trusted put together...
No, never. No, they're my films. I got my name above the title. I better be in on it.
Well, it's interesting about you when you say that. You're one of those directors whose name does go above the title because you have a name brand.
One thing they taught me in film school was no matter what, if you're a gun for hire or you write the screenplay yourself, no matter what, make it your own film. Make it personal. Bring something to it. One of my teachers at film school was Orson Welles, and he said, look, sometimes I do scripts because there's a great chase in the 10th reel, and I can do something with that chase. He said, I just don't do it for necessarily the whole movie, but when I do it, it's all mine. So I have the same philosophy.
He chose it a few times for a few of his movies, starting off with The Fog. So you would think, again, it was in Halloween, but nope, that was ITC Serif Gothic. The Fog in 1980, the opening credits for that one have a little bit of Futura in it, which again kind of leans into the clean kind of like style that Albertus has.
11:55, almost midnight. Enough time for one more story. One more story before 12. Just to keep us warm.
So you have to think that was the inspiration to then start going to using Albertus fully in Escape from New York in 1981. And I did read that according to the credits and to Escape from New York, the titles were done by a company called Pacific Title. I'm sure there are scholars out there that have done more research than I did that will know whether or not Carpenter chose this or it was chosen by Pacific Title. I have to think they would have looked back at Carpenter's work and see the decisions he'd made before and seeing he used Futura and The Fog. Okay, well, let's just use this for Escape. It's kind of similar. It kind of makes sense. It kind of feels consistent. He uses it again in the title credits for The Thing in 1982, but not the title card, because that had that really cool effect with the reveal of the logo that I think was done with like strobe lights in a trash bag or something like that whenever you see kind of like the behind the scenes. But the title credit sequence, not the title card, was Albertus. Christine, 1983, like The Thing in the title sequence, but not the title card, because that uses the Plymouth Fury badge. So it kind of leans into the logo of the car. Starman in 84. So when you think of his catalog, right, the one movie that gets nominated for an Oscar and Jeff Bridges' performance feels the least John Carpenter, but still leans into Albertus for the font. Big Trouble in Little China in 86, Prince of Darkness in 87, and then there's They Live. That title sequence, again, has Albertus, but the title card itself has that really cool reveal where it goes from like the font that has a graffiti style to kind of like the fade in into the wall. Mm-hmm. But everything else before that, Albertus font.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Escape from LA in 96, and not necessarily the most beloved of the latter date Carpenters, but I did find a quote from the title designer, Nina Saxon, that said in an interview, they asked her if Albertus was the first choice in the title's film's credits, and she said, no, we showed them a lot of fonts, but that's the one they picked. And I have to think when she says they're probably talking about Carpenter, and it feels, again, if you look at his filmography, it's Albertus.
This is a guy that, whether he was doing it consciously or not, like he was kind of coming up with a brand is certainly early in his career as he was establishing himself. And a lot of that had to do with familiarity. It was using the same people on the cast and crew. So you've got your Jamie Lee Curtis, Deborah Hill, Charles Cyphers, Dean Cundy, the cinematographer. There's a lot of familiar names and faces that you will see on screen and in the credits. And this is just another way to do it, I think. It's just, instantly recognizable. Like, you could be listening to us talk about this and be like, have little idea what the fuck we're talking about. But if you think directed by John Carpenter, cinematography by Dean Cundy, and you picture that as you're watching the opening credits, that's Albertus. And that's in, as you just, laid out in so many of his movies, that's, again, is just, it's establishing that repetition, and it's establishing at this point, I don't think it's a well-regarded thing, but if you were to talk about Albertus, it would be considered in many circles as the, quote, John Carpenter font, which is pretty incredible for something that was, first created around like woodcut, in the 30s. And no surprise, like what you were saying, Bernie, about it being like a Gothic style font. It's something that the city of London has used on all of its signage, all of its street signage. So anyone that's had the privilege of going to London, as I have, you'll see it, all over the city. So again, like it's recognizing these things and seeing it out in the world, seeing it up on screen. We geek out on it, and you may geek out less about it listening to it, but it's still kind of cool how, again, thought goes into this stuff. It wasn't just like, whatever, just the classic Ryan Gosling skit on SNL with Papyrus for Avatar. It's like,
sure,
lazy graphic designer just clicked on the drop down window and just picked like it's not like a case of that as they're putting the titles together and the credits to be like, yeah, whatever you got, just throw it up there. Like it's a conscious choice to, whether the first time was an accident or not. Clearly, John Carpenter liked it, and from there on out, in most of his films, that is what you see for your opening credits on the titles.
Where did your love of films and filmmaking begin?
In movie theaters when I was a little kid. My mom was a big movie fanatic and took me to everything. And the little town I grew up in, there were 2 downtown theaters and there were 2 drive-ins. And I just went all the time. That's where I fell in love with cinema.
And this was in Kentucky?
That's right. Small town in Kentucky, Bowling Green.
Now I can't help but thinking, Pete, considering we had the privilege of going to Kentucky, back to John Carpenter's, the place where he grew up. If he had actually grown up in London and been a Londoner and had his career as it was, would they have named a street after him? And then it would have been John Carpenter's John Carpenter Boulevard in his font, Albertus. So much possibilities.
Don't quote me on this. I want to say that there is a John Carpenter Street in London.
Now, have you always been drawn to genre, whether it's Western or thriller or science fiction or horror?
Man, in the beginning, I just wanted to be a director. I didn't care.